The moment my mate looked me in the eyes and said I wasn't enough, I felt something crack open inside my chest. Not my heart. Something older. Something that had been waiting a very long time to wake up. The worst part wasn't the rejection. It wasn't the silence that swallowed the room, or the 200 pack members staring at me like I was a stain on the ceremonial floor. It wasn't even the way Calder's jaw tightened, like rejecting me was an inconvenience he'd been politely tolerating for months. The worst part was that I had worn my good shirt. Stupid, I know, but I'd ironed it myself that morning, standing in my cramped bathroom in our PAC's community house in Hartford, Connecticut, telling myself today was the day everything changed. And I'd even put on the cedar cologne my mother left me before she disappeared, the one I only opened for important moments. I smelled like hope. And hope, I was quickly learning, had a terrible sense of timing. Eliot. Calder's voice cut through the murmur of the Crescent Vale pack gathering. Deep, flat, final. The kind of voice that didn't ask questions. The kind that issued verdicts. I lifted my chin. If I was going down, I was going down, looking him in the eye. Calder Ashford stood at the center of the claim circle. The stone-floored clearing at the heart of our PAC's ceremonial hall, ringed by amber lanterns and the expressionless faces of every wolf who had ever watched me fail. He was tall, broad-shouldered, classically handsome in the way that made you forget he had the emotional range of a filing cabinet. His dark hair was combed back. His ceremonial jacket was pressed. He looked like a man about to sign a document, not sever a bond. I, Calder Ashford, ranked Alpha of Crescent Vale, he began, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall. Formally reject Eliot Voss as my designated Omega mate. Someone in the crowd inhaled sharply. Someone else? I suspected Marcus, my only actual friend, whispered a quiet, devastated no. I stood perfectly still. Don't flinch. Don't give them tears. Don't you dare. The bond was never completed, Calder continued, smooth as river ice. Eliot Voss has shown insufficient standing, socially, politically, and biologically, to serve as a mate to a ranked alpha of this pack. Biologically. That word landed like a slap with a closed fist. He meant my designation. See, I was an Omega. That part wasn't the problem. The problem, according to Crescent Vale's charming social hierarchy, was that I was what they called a silent Omega. No secondary scent presentation, no heat cycle on record, no instinctive submission response in the presence of an alpha's dominance. To most of this pack, that made me defective. Broken. An Omega in name only, like a car with no engine. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was exactly why those biological markers were absent, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. This rejection is witnessed. Elder Haynes announced from the far end of the hall, his reedy voice bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. The designation bond between Calder Ashford and Eliot Voss is hereby dissolved. Polite, performative murmuring rippled through the crowd. I exhaled slowly through my nose. Cedar and silence. Very poetic. Calder finally looked directly at me. Really looked, maybe for the first time in the 3 years we'd been paired. And something moved behind his eyes. Something that might have been guilt, if I believed Calder Ashford was capable of guilt. You understand, this is nothing personal, he said, low enough that only I could hear. I smiled at him. My most serene, unbothered, completely devastating smile. Of course, I said. Nothing personal. You just publicly announced I'm biologically inferior in front of our entire pack while wearing your fancy jacket. Totally casual. His eye twitched. I turned and walked away before he could respond. Because the thing about a perfect exit is timing. And also because if I stood there one more second, I was genuinely going to combust, not metaphorically. I had reasons to worry about that particular outcome. The crowd parted around me, Some faces held pity, some satisfaction, a few quiet horror. I kept my expression neutral and my hands loose at my sides, very carefully not thinking about the warmth gathering beneath my palms. The slow, familiar tingle that crept up my forearms whenever my emotions spiked and my control slipped. Not here. Not now. Breathe. I made it to the side corridor before Marcus fell into step beside me, his lanky frame appearing from nowhere like a stressed golden retriever. Eliot, hey, talk to me. I'm fine. You're doing the hand thing. I looked down. My fingers were faintly luminous. A soft amber glow pulsing just under the skin, rhythmic as a second heartbeat. Pyrokinesis, or that was my particular secret. Inconvenient, unregistered, and absolutely none of Calder Ashford's business. I closed my fist and the glow died. I said I'm fine, Marcus. He was quiet for a beat. Then, very carefully, your shirt looks nice. I laughed. Short, involuntary, embarrassingly real. And the last of the heat drained from my hands. I ironed it myself, I said. I know. I watched you do it for 45 minutes this morning. We walked in silence toward the exit, the sounds of the gathering fading behind us. Cool November air rushed in as I pushed through the heavy oak doors, Hartford's skyline glittering distantly through the bare trees of the pack grounds. I stood on the stone steps and breathed. Rejected. Publicly. Efficiently. On a Tuesday. Somewhere behind those closed doors. Calder Ashford was probably already moving on with his life, unbothered and perfectly pressed. And somewhere, I didn't know where yet, didn't know why the thought arrived with such strange certainty. Something was coming. Something that smelled nothing like cedar. Something that smelled like a storm. I stood there on those cold stone steps, turning that thought over like a coin I didn't remember picking up. Marcus was saying something beside me. Something about getting food, about the diner on Elm Street that stayed open late, about how rejection technically burned calories because stress was a metabolic event. But his voice was fading under the low hum building at the base of my skull. Not pain. Not quite. More like frequency. Like a radio finding a signal it didn't know it was searching for. Now, Eliot. Shh. I was literally in the middle of a sentence. Marcus, shh. He went quiet, bless him, mostly because he'd known me long enough to recognize the difference between rude and alarmed. Right now, I was both, and the alarm was winning. The air had changed. It was subtle. The kind of subtle that most Omegas probably wouldn't catch, especially on a cold November evening in Hartford when the wind was pulling dead leaves across the pack grounds and everything smelled like wood smoke and frost. But I had never been a typical Omega, and my senses had always operated at a frequency slightly above what the pack considered normal. Another thing I kept to myself. There were two new scents threading through the cold, not sweet, not warm in the easy domestic way that most alpha scents presented. These were different. Now one was like dark water and raw iron, deep and still and ancient in a way that made my hindbrain sit up straight. The other was sharp and electric, like the air right before a lightning strike, like ozone and pine resin and something burning clean. Separately, they were striking. Together, they were almost unbearable. My fingers tingled. Okay, Marcus said slowly, following my gaze toward the long gravel path that curved around the east side of the ceremonial hall. You have your weird face on. I have one face. You have 14 faces, and this specific one means something is either very wrong or very interesting. Could be both. Eliot. The black SUV came around the curve of the path without hurrying, which somehow made it more intimidating than if it had arrived fast. When it moved with the kind of unhurried certainty that belongs to people who have never needed to rush because the world has always waited for them. No pack insignia on the exterior, tinted windows, government plates from out of state, I caught the blue and gold of Colorado before it stopped a careful 30 feet from the hall's entrance. The doors opened. The men who stepped out were not from Crescent Vale. That much was immediately obvious, the way gravity is obvious, the way cold is obvious. You don't have to be told, you simply know. The first one was tall in the way that redefined the word. Not runway tall. Structurally tall, like a building, like something that had been designed specifically to take up space and own it without apology. Dark skin, close-cut natural hair, on a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone with strong opinions. He wore a charcoal coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and he moved through the cold air like it owed him something. His eyes swept the grounds with the flat professional efficiency of someone who had cataloged threats before most people finished their morning coffee. That was the iron and dark water scent. I knew it immediately. The second man came around from the passenger side, and he was the reason the word striking existed. Slightly leaner, though not by much. Warm brown skin, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that caught the lantern light from the hall's entrance and held it in a way that felt deliberate. His hair was longer on top, a little windswept, like he hadn't bothered fixing it and genuinely could not have cared less. And there was a scar, faint, silvered, cutting through the left edge of his upper lip, and rather than diminishing anything about his face, it made him look like someone who had already survived the worst thing that could happen and found it mildly inconvenient. That was the ozone and pine. Obviously. They stood side by side for exactly 2 seconds before their attention landed on me. Not on the hall. Not on the crowd sounds still filtering through the oak doors. On me specifically, with the focused precision of 2 people who had been looking for something and were considering the possibility that they'd just found it. My mouth went a little dry. My hands stayed warm. Suspiciously warm. Do not glow, I told my palms, firmly and internally. This is not the moment. Those are not Hartford wolves, Marcus whispered beside me, with the energy of a man watching a nature documentary about apex predators from a very thin tree branch. No, I agreed. Do you know them? Obviously not. Then why are they looking at you like... Marcus, if you finish that sentence, I will not share my fries with you tonight. He closed his mouth. The taller one, iron and dark water, spoke first. His voice carried across the cold air without effort, not loud, just the kind of voice that occupied space the way his body did, completely and without negotiation. Eliot Voss. Not a question. A confirmation. Something about hearing my name in that voice did something structurally unsound to my ribcage. I ignored it with the practiced ease of someone who had been ignoring inconvenient physical responses his entire adult life. I tilted my head. It depends on who's asking and whether this is about the thing in Providence, because I can explain that. The electric one, ozone and pine, blinked. Then, slowly, the corner of his scarred mouth curved. Not a full smile, just the suggestion of one. The footnote of a smile. The kind that said he was used to people being nervous around him and had not expected amusement. It's not about Providence, the taller one said. He exchanged a brief glance with his companion, and something passed between them in that look. Some wordless negotiation that landed and resolved in under a second. The way people communicate when they've spent years learning the exact language of each other's silences. They looked back at me. We need to speak with you, the taller one continued. Privately, my name is Dorian Vance. He paused. And the pause had weight. Alpha King, Western Territories. The lantern light flickered. Behind me, through the hall's oak doors, I could hear the tail end of the Crescent Vale gathering, the polite shuffling of a pack moving on with their evening, completely unaware. My name had just been spoken by an Alpha King. 2 of them. On the same night, my designated mate had rejected me in front of everyone I knew, while I was wearing my good shirt. I looked at Dorian Vance. I looked at the electric one, who still hadn't given his name, but whose scar footnote smile had graduated into something that felt genuinely dangerous for my cardiovascular health. Then I looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at me with the expression of a man who understood, on a molecular level, that his quiet Tuesday had just ended. I'll get the fries to go," he said. I turned back to the two Alpha Kings standing in the cold Hartford night, smelling like iron and lightning, looking at me like I was either the answer to something or the beginning of it. I lifted my chin. "Privately," I said. "Sure, but I want it on the record that I've had a genuinely terrible evening. I'm emotionally fragile in a way I will absolutely not be admitting again, and if either of you says the word biologically in the next 24 hours, I will not be held responsible for what happens." The Electric One's smile completed itself. Full, slow, like sunrise deciding to show up after all, and the frequency at the base of my skull sang. I wanted to ignore it. I was, historically, very good at ignoring things that my body decided were important without consulting the rest of me first. I ignored the warmth that gathered in my hands when I was angry. I ignored the way certain alphas' sense made my designation instinct sit up and pay embarrassing attention. I had been ignoring inconvenient biological responses since I was 16 years old and accidentally melted the handle off my high school locker during finals week. Ignoring things was practically my love language. But this frequency was different. It wasn't loud. It wasn't demanding. It just sat at the base of my skull like a tuning fork that had finally found its note, quiet and certain, and absolutely unbothered by my opinion on the matter. I hated it immediately. "Walk with us," Dorian said. Not a command exactly, but not a request either. I'm somewhere in the diplomatic middle, the way someone speaks when they're used to being obeyed but are currently choosing manners. "I'm not really a walk with strangers kind of person," I said. "Call it a personal policy, very consistent. I've held it for years." "We're not strangers," the Electric One said. His voice was the first time I'd heard it fully, and it did something deeply unfair to the air between us. Lower than I expected. A little rough at the edges, like he didn't use it gently as a rule. "You already know who we are." "I know your friend's name and your general threat level," I said. "That's not the same as not being strangers. That's just being informed strangers. Slightly more dangerous, actually." His eyes held mine, and the scar-completed smile didn't move, but something behind his gaze shifted, recalibrated, like I had said something that didn't match whatever file he'd built on me before arriving. Good. I preferred being a surprise. "Caspian Coal," he said. "Alpha King, Eastern Territories." He let that land. It landed. 2 Alpha Kings, both Western and Eastern Territories, which together represented the largest consolidated pack authority in the continental United States. The kind of power that made Crescent Vale's entire social hierarchy look like a middle school student council. The kind of power that made Elder Haynes and his ceremonial announcements look like a very committed hobby. And they were standing in a Hartford parking area, in the cold, asking me to take a walk. On the night I'd been publicly rejected. On the night I'd worn my good shirt. I breathed in slowly through my nose and made a decision that my common sense would have voted against if I'd given it the opportunity to vote. "Fine," I said. "We walk, but I set the pace." Dorian's expression didn't change. Caspian's almost did. We moved away from the hall's entrance, down the gravel path that curved along the edge of the pack grounds where the trees started. Old oaks and bare maples standing like patient witnesses in the dark. The lantern light thinned. The sounds of the gathering faded. My boots crunched against gravel and frost, and I was acutely, uncomfortably aware of both men flanking me at a respectful distance that was somehow more unsettling than if they'd crowded close. They smelled extraordinary. That was the problem. Up close, Dorian's scent was layered in a way that made my Omega instincts do slow. It complicated math. Dark water over iron over something warm that I hadn't cataloged yet. Something that felt almost like safety, which was the most suspicious thing a scent could feel like when it belonged to a stranger. Caspian's was sharper, more immediate, ozone and pine and that clean-burning electricity that made the fine hair on my arms lift slightly. Together, they were genuinely a lot to process. I focused on the gravel. "How do you know my name?" I asked. "Practical, grounded, good." "We've been aware of you for approximately 8 months, Dorian said. I stopped walking. They stopped with me, which somehow irritated me more than if they'd kept going. 8 months, I repeated. Yes. You've known about me for 8 months. Correct. I turned to look at him fully. And you chose tonight, specifically tonight, which was, for the record, already a deeply unpleasant evening. You waited 8 months and picked the one night where I got publicly described as biologically insufficient in front of 200 people and then showed up in a nice coat asking me to take a walk. Dorian had the grace to look mildly uncomfortable. It was a very small discomfort, controlled and brief, but it was there. The timing was not ideal, he admitted. Not ideal, I said. Right. It was necessary, Caspian said from my other side. I turned to look at him and immediately regretted it slightly because up close in the low light his face was doing things that required concentration to look past. We needed to see how you handled the rejection. The words dropped into the space between us and sat there. I stared at him. You watched. We arrived before the ceremony concluded, he said without flinching. Yes. You stood there, I said slowly, and watched Calder Ashford tell an entire room I was biologically insufficient, and you did not intervene because you were testing me. Observing, Dorian offered. That's a softer word for the same thing, and I want you to know it's not working. I crossed my arms. The warmth in my hands pulsed once, restless. I pressed my fingers against my own forearms and held it down. What exactly were you hoping to see? Whether you'd break, Caspian said. Silence. Wind moved through the oak branches overhead, rattling dry leaves, and somewhere distant a car moved along the highway beyond the pack grounds, its headlights briefly sweeping the darkness. And? I said. You didn't, he said. You smiled at him. Then you made a joke about the jacket. It was a very pressed jacket. You walked out with your shoulders straight and your hands at your sides, and you didn't let them see anything. Something in Caspian's voice had shifted, dropped a register, and the electric edge of his scent intensified by a fraction. That takes more control than most ranked alphas I know. I looked at him for a long moment. The frequency in my skull hummed. That's a compliment, I said. I'm choosing to receive it and also still be annoyed about the observation thing. The side of his mouth moved. That footnote again. Fair, he said. I uncrossed my arms and started walking again because standing still felt dangerous in a way I couldn't fully quantify. They fell back into step with me, unhurried, and for a stretch of moments none of us spoke. The gravel path curved gently away from the hall, and the tree cover thickened slightly, and the cold bit sharper here, away from the lanterns. Why me? I finally asked. Quiet. Honest. The question I'd been building toward since the moment they said my name. There are designated Omegas across the entire country. Ranked ones, bonded ones with full biological presentations and proper secondary sense and all the things I supposedly don't have. So why are 2 Alpha Kings standing in Hartford in November asking a rejected, unranked, silent Omega to take a walk? Dorian and Caspian exchanged one of those brief, wordless looks again, that silent language moving between them in under a second. Then Dorian reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal coat and withdrew a small envelope. Cream-colored. Sealed with dark wax pressed into the shape of a mark I didn't immediately recognize, 2 overlapping circles with something angular at their center. He held it out. I looked at it without taking it. What is that? An explanation, Dorian said. And an invitation. To what? Our territory, Caspian said. Colorado. We want you to come to Ashford Peak. I almost laughed. Actually, I did laugh, a short, disbelieving sound that fogged in the cold air. You want the Omega who just got rejected on a Tuesday in Connecticut to come to Colorado with 2 Alpha Kings he met 11 minutes ago. Yes, Dorian said, completely serious. That's insane. Probably, Caspian agreed, and the casual honesty of it knocked the laugh out of me again. I looked at the envelope. I looked at the two of them. I looked back at the envelope. My palms were warm. The frequency was singing. And somewhere deep in the part of me that had been silent and cold and carefully locked down since I was old enough to understand what I was, something pressed against the inside of that lock like it had just remembered there was a door. I took the envelope. I didn't open it, but I took it. I'm not promising anything, I said. We're not asking for promises, Dorian said. I still think this is insane. Noted, Caspian said. And this time, the footnote smile was accompanied by the full, quiet weight of his gaze, dark and direct, and entirely too certain for someone I had known for less than 15 minutes. I looked away first. I absolutely counted that as a loss and decided not to think about it. The gravel crunched under my boots. The cold pressed in, and the envelope felt warm between my fingers, which was probably my own body heat and definitely nothing else. Definitely. I held that word in my head all the way back to Marcus, who was waiting at the edge of the path with 2 paper bags from the diner on Elm Street, a look of barely contained crisis on his face, and the energy of someone who had spent the last 20 minutes stress ordering. I got you the burger, he said, handing me a bag. And the fries, and a milkshake because you got publicly rejected tonight and dairy is emotionally appropriate. You're a good person, Marcus. I know. His eyes moved past me to where Dorian and Caspian had stopped at a respectful distance, waiting with the particular stillness of men who were very good at being patient without looking like they were being patient. Are they coming with us? No, I said. Yes, Caspian said from behind me. I turned around. He looked completely unbothered. Dorian stood beside him with his hands in his coat pockets, the picture of diplomatic composure, which I was beginning to understand was just his face's default setting regardless of what was actually happening. I thought you wanted me to come to Colorado, I said. We do, Dorian said. But you haven't agreed yet and we're not leaving Hartford without a decision. So you're just going to follow me around until I give you one. We prefer the term accompany, Caspian said. Of course you do. Marcus looked between all 3 of us with the focused attention of someone watching a tennis match that had somehow become personally relevant to his safety. Then he held out the second paper bag toward Dorian. I got extra fries, he said helpfully. Dorian looked at the bag. Something almost human moved across his face. Thank you. Marcus, I said. What? They look hungry. Also, one of them is an Alpha King, and I was raised with manners, Eliot. I pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of my nose and breathed. This was my life now, apparently. We ended up at Riverside Park because Marcus had already been walking toward it, and momentum is a powerful force. And because by the time I registered where we were going, it seemed like more effort to redirect than to simply accept it. The park ran along the Connecticut River, narrow and quiet at this hour, the water dark and moving steadily below the embankment. Wooden benches faced the river under bare trees. The city lights caught the water's surface and broke into scattered pieces. It was actually beautiful, which felt slightly inconvenient given the circumstances. Marcus sat on one bench with his fries and the diplomatic self-preservation instincts of someone who understood he was in the presence of apex-level pack authority and had chosen the response of minding his business cheerfully from 6 feet away. I sat on the next bench. Dorian sat beside me. Caspian sat on my other side. The warmth came back to my hands immediately. Not dangerous warmth, not the kind that meant I was about to do something structurally inadvisable to the immediate environment. Just warmth, steady and low and annoyingly consistent. I unwrapped my burger and took a bite because I was hungry, and also because eating gave my hands something to do. Open the envelope, Caspian said. I'm eating. You can do both. I choose not to. He was quiet for a moment. The river moved. A distant siren crossed the city somewhere behind us and faded. You're stalling, he said. I'm savoring, I corrected. There's a difference. One is avoidance, the other is intentional enjoyment of a meal during an emotionally complicated evening. Is there a meaningful distinction from where I'm sitting? I took another deliberate bite and looked straight ahead at the river. Dorian made a sound that might, in a different man, have been a suppressed laugh. I looked at him sharply. His face was composed. Perfectly, suspiciously composed. Did you just almost laugh? No, he said. Your face did something. My face is neutral. Your face tried to do something and then changed its mind, and I saw it. He looked at me, and up close, without the ceremony hall's lanterns and the weight of 200 witnesses and the adrenaline of the confrontation, his eyes were darker than I'd clocked initially. The kind of dark that had depth to it, that made you wonder what was underneath the professional stillness he wore like a second coat. You're observant, he said. Not a deflection. More like a fact he was filing away. I have to be, I said, before I could decide whether I wanted to say it. The words sat between us, honest and slightly too revealing, and I felt Caspian go very still on my other side the way a person goes still when they've heard something they didn't expect and are being careful not to react in case you stop talking. I ate my fries. The river moved. Finally, I wiped my hands on a napkin, set the food bag aside, and picked up the envelope. The wax seal was pressed clean, 2 overlapping circles with a stylized mountain peak at their center. The Ashford Peak territorial mark. I'd seen it in Pack Authority documents before, the kind of official correspondence that arrived at Crescent Vale occasionally and got discussed in hushed tones by the elders. I broke the seal. Inside was a single folded card, thick cream stock, and a printed letter with 2 signatures at the bottom. Dorian's signature was angular and precise. Caspian's was faster, looser, the handwriting of someone who thought quicker than the pen could keep up. I read it. Then I read it again. The river kept moving. You want me to come to Ashford Peak as a guest of both Alpha Kings, I said slowly. For a period of not less than 30 days, during which time you intend to formally present me to the Joint Territorial Council as a candidate for the position of... I paused. I looked up. You're serious? We're serious, Dorian confirmed. Joint Omega consort to both Alpha Kings of the Western and Eastern Territories. Yes, Caspian said. That's not a position that currently exists. We're creating it. I stared at him. For me. For you, he said. His voice was even, but his eyes were doing something that didn't match the evenness. Something that had been controlled carefully and was leaking slightly at the edges. I put the card down on my knee and looked at the river for a long moment. Okay, I said. I have questions. Many questions. All right, I'm going to ask them in order, and I need you to answer without doing that thing where you exchange looks and have a whole conversation with your eyebrows. We don't, Dorian started. You absolutely do, Marcus called from the other bench. You've done it 4 times since we sat down. Dorian closed his mouth. Question 1, I said. Why me? Real answer this time, not the testing speech. Caspian leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at the river rather than at me. It was the first time he hadn't looked directly at me since we'd met, and the change was noticeable in the way a sudden absence of sound is noticeable. There are 6 territorial councils across the country, he said. All of them are currently pushing for Dorian and me to take separate Omega consorts, separate bonds, separate pack alliances. He paused. They want to divide the Western and Eastern territories. A joint consort bond between both kings to a single Omega would make that division legally and politically impossible. So I'm a political solution, I said flatly. You're the only Omega in the country whose designation profile is compatible with a dual bond, Dorian said. We've been looking for 8 months. Silent Omega presentation, no active scent anchor, no existing pack bond. He looked at me steadily. You're not a political solution, Eliot. You're the only solution. The only solution. I let that sit inside my chest and examined the feeling it produced, which was complicated and layered and involved several emotions that I wasn't prepared to name on a park bench in Hartford on the worst Tuesday of my life. Question 2, I said. Do you actually want this? Both of you. Not politically, not territorially. Do you actually want to bond with someone you've never met? Silence. A real one. The kind that had texture. Caspian turned his head and looked at me, and the electric edge of his scent crested slightly, that ozone and pine sharpening in a way that was completely involuntary and completely unambiguous to anyone with functional Omega senses. I've been standing 10 feet from you for 40 minutes, he said quietly, and I haven't been able to stop tracking where you are in my peripheral vision since the moment you walked out of that hall. My pulse did something I was choosing not to acknowledge. That's instinct, I said. That's not wanting. I know the difference, he said. And the way he said it, low and certain and without any performance attached to it, made the distinction feel suddenly very thin. I looked at Dorian. He met my gaze without flinching. I want you in our territory, he said. I want 30 days for you to see what we're offering and decide with full information. I don't ask for anything beyond that. Not yet. Not yet. 2 words. So simple, so entirely too much to think about. The wind came off the river and moved through my hair, and I smelled iron and lightning, and I hated, with every rational cell in my body, how right it felt. The warmth in my hands was steady and soft and constant. I picked up my milkshake. I took a long sip. I have 14 more questions, I said. We have time, Dorian said. And I'm not agreeing to anything tonight. Understood, Caspian said. And if anyone in your territory calls me biologically insufficient, I'm going home immediately. Anyone who says that to you won't be in our territory for long, Dorian said, and the quietness of it was somehow more convincing than if he'd shouted it. I looked at the river. The city lights broke on the water's surface into scattered, shifting pieces. Somewhere behind us, Marcus was eating his fries with the focused tranquility of a man who had decided that whatever was happening was above his pay grade, and the best response was carbohydrates. I pressed the cold cup of the milkshake against my warm palm and felt the contrast of it, cold against heat, and thought about envelopes and invitations and 30 days in Colorado, and 2 men who smelled like the end of something I hadn't known was beginning. Question 3, I said. Caspian leaned back on the bench, turned his face up toward the dark Hartford sky, and said, Ask. And I did. Question 3 was about the Territorial Council, specifically who sat on it and whether any of them had the authority to override a dual bond claim if they decided they didn't like the outcome. Dorian answered that one with the precise, unhurried detail of someone who had spent years navigating political architecture and found it neither exciting nor threatening, just geography. Question 4 was about the 30 days, what it meant practically. Whether I'd be expected to perform anything, present anywhere, smile at anyone in a way that implied decisions I hadn't made yet. Caspian answered that one, and his answer was shorter than Dorian's but somehow more reassuring, which I noted and filed under things I wasn't going to examine too closely tonight. Now, question 5 was whether they'd done this before, whether there had been other candidates. Other Omegas brought to Ashford Peak for 30 days who had left without bonding. That one landed differently. Both of them went quiet in a way that was distinct from their earlier silences. This one had weight to it. History. There was one, Dorian said finally. 14 months ago. What happened? Another pause. Caspian's jaw tightened by a fraction, the first visible physical tension I'd seen from him, and it told me more than a full sentence would have. He chose to leave, Dorian said. That was his right. We didn't contest it. I looked at Caspian's jaw, the small, tight line of it. The way his eyes stayed fixed on the river with a steadiness that was working slightly too hard. But it cost something, I said quietly. Not a question. Caspian looked at me then, direct, unguarded for exactly 1 second before the control reassembled itself. Everything costs something, he said. I understood that in a way that went deeper than sympathy, the kind of understanding that lives in your bones instead of your head. I looked down at the milkshake cup in my hands, now mostly empty, cold against my palms. My mother left when I was 9, I said. I didn't plan to say it. It arrived the way honest things sometimes do, without permission, through a gap in the defenses that the cold and the river and the strange, exhausted openness of the evening had apparently created. She was an Omega, fully presented, full heat cycle, the whole biological picture that I apparently missed out on inheriting. I turned the cup slowly between my hands. She bonded with my father, who was a beta, which the pack considered a waste of a good Omega. They made her life difficult for years. Small things. The kind of cruelty that's hard to name because none of it is ever quite large enough to point at directly. Neither of them spoke. They were listening with their whole bodies, the particular quality of attention that meant they weren't waiting for me to finish so they could respond. They were just receiving it. It was disarming. I pushed through it. She left because she couldn't breathe here anymore. In this pack, in this territory. I paused. She sent letters for 2 years. Then she stopped. I don't know if something happened to her or if she just needed to be completely gone to survive. I've never decided which one I prefer to believe. The river moved below us, dark and steady. My father raised me alone after that. He did his best. He was a good man. I stopped, corrected myself. He is a good man. He moved to New Hampshire 4 years ago when I aged out of the pack's dependent housing. We talk on the phone. It's fine. Fine. The most load-bearing word in the English language. So when Calder's designation was arranged, I continued, I told myself it was practical. I told myself I wasn't looking for what my mother had, that full-scent bond thing, that consuming recognition. I told myself I didn't need to be chosen. I just needed stability. I exhaled, which is a very mature and emotionally healthy thing to tell yourself, and also a complete lie that I maintained for 3 years. Dorian shifted beside me, not moving closer, just shifting in a way that changed the air between us slightly. Warmer, much more present. When did you know it wasn't working? He asked. Probably the first month, I said. Definitely by the end of the first year. Calder never once asked me a question that wasn't logistical, not one. 3 years, and the man never asked me what I was thinking unless it was directly relevant to a pack obligation. I looked up at the dark sky above the tree line. I used to practice conversations in my head, things I wanted to tell him, observations, jokes, things I'd read, just to see if I could make him actually look at me. I paused. He never looked, not the way a person looks at something they're genuinely curious about. Silence. Then Caspian said, very quietly, I've been looking at you since the moment you walked out of that hall. I felt the words land somewhere central and unprotected. I didn't turn to look at him. I wasn't ready to look at him when he said things like that. That could still just be instinct, I said, but my voice had lost some of its certainty and we both knew it. It could be, he agreed. I'm not asking you to decide what it is tonight. I pressed my lips together. Dorian spoke, and his voice had shifted from its earlier diplomatic register into something more careful, the way a person speaks when they're choosing to offer something they don't offer easily. I was raised in the Western Territories' Alpha lineage, 5th generation. My entire life was structured around what I would become, what alliances I'd hold, what the territory needed from me. He paused. I was bonded once, informally. Not a completed mate bond, but close enough that severing it required a formal council proceeding. I looked at him. I couldn't help it. His profile was sharp against the city-lit sky, jaw set, eyes on the middle distance. He looked like a man who had made peace with something difficult and revisited that peace occasionally to make sure it was still holding. His name was Brennan, Dorian said. He was a ranked Omega from a council family. The relationship was approved, encouraged, politically convenient. Everything my upbringing told me a bond should be. A pause. He ended it because he said being with me felt like standing next to a wall, present but impenetrable. The honesty of it was striking. Not because it was confessional, but because he delivered it without self-pity, with the same clean accuracy he used for everything else. Just a fact. A costly one. I heard him, Dorian continued. I understood what he meant, and I spent the following 2 years trying to determine whether what he described was a flaw in my character or a function of my position. He looked at me then, and the depth in his eyes that I'd noticed earlier was fully visible now. No professional filter over it. I haven't decided yet. That's a very honest thing to say, I said. You asked honest questions. I held his gaze for a moment, then looked away because looking at Dorian Vance for too long felt like standing close to the edge of something you hadn't decided whether to jump from yet. The park was quiet around us. Marcus had gone still on his bench, no longer eating, just sitting with the thoughtful silence of someone who was bearing witness to something he understood was significant. The cold had deepened while we talked. I could feel it through my jacket now, working its way to my shoulders, and the warmth in my hands had been steady and low and continuous for the last hour in a way it never usually sustained. It wasn't distress warmth. It wasn't anger warmth. It was something else. Something I didn't have a word for yet because I'd never felt it before in quite this configuration. Question 6, I said, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. Go ahead, Caspian said. If I come to Colorado, if I do the 30 days? I turned the empty milkshake cup in my hands. What happens if neither of us wants to bond at the end of it? What happens to me? Do I come back to Hartford, to a pack that just watched me get rejected, and pick up like none of this occurred? The question had a sharp edge to it that I hadn't fully acknowledged until it was out in the open. That was the one that had been sitting underneath all the others. The real risk. Not theirs. Mine. Dorian answered without hesitation. You would have full territorial guest protection for as long as you want it. Ashford Peak would formally record your residency, which would supersede Crescent Vale's designation records. You would never have to return to Hartford if you chose not to. And the rejection on record, I said. Calder's public rejection tonight. That follows me everywhere in the current pack system. Not if you're under King's protection, Caspian said. A dual King's record supersedes a Pack Alpha's rejection notation. Completely. I sat with that. The practical reality of it settled through me slowly, the way cold water settles, touching every part of the space it enters. Even if nothing else worked. Even if 30 days in Colorado produced nothing but awkwardness and incompatibility, and the confirmation that instinct and reality were two different things. I would leave with my record cleared and my designation standing intact. That was not nothing. That was quietly. Everything. Okay, I said. Caspian went still. Dorian turned to look at me. Okay, as in you'll come? Dorian said. Okay, as in I'll come. I stood up because I needed to be on my feet for this, needed the cold ground under my boots and the open air above me. 30 days, no promises, no performance. If I'm miserable, I say so. If something is wrong, I say so. I don't do silence for the sake of keeping the peace, and I don't smile through things that deserve to be argued about. Good, Caspian said, and he stood too, and the word came out with a warmth that his voice didn't always carry, something that surfaced from somewhere underneath the controlled electric edge of him. Dorian stood. The three of us faced each other in the cold riverside park, the city quiet around us, bare trees overhead, the river moving below. There's one more thing, Dorian said. Something you should know before we leave Hartford. The shift in his tone made the warmth in my hands pulse once. The previous Omega candidate who left 14 months ago, he said. His name was Calder Ashford. I felt the name register slowly, the way a sound registers when you hear it at a distance before you understand what made it. Ashford. Calder Ashford's older brother, Dorian said. The cold pressed in from all sides. I looked at Dorian. I looked at Caspian. Caspian's jaw had that tight line again, the one I'd clocked earlier, the one that meant history was pressing against the present, and he was holding the boundary between them by force of will. Declan left, Caspian said quietly. But before he did, he told Calder everything about us, about the dual bond, about what we were looking for. His eyes met mine and held. Calder knew who we were before tonight. He knew what a rejection on his record would mean for you. He knew it would make you eligible. The river kept moving. My hands were very warm. He rejected me, I said slowly, because he knew it would send me to you. Neither of them said yes. Neither of them had to. I stood in the cold Hartford night with an empty milkshake cup in my hand and the cream-colored envelope in my pocket and the warmth of something old and unnameable pulsing under my skin. And I thought about Calder's flat voice in that ceremony hall and the practiced efficiency of it, and the word biologically delivered like a door being closed from the inside. He didn't do you a favor, Caspian said carefully. That's not what I'm saying. I know, I said. What he did was still... I know, I said again, softer. Marcus appeared at my elbow with the quiet expertise of a person who understood exactly when to show up. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, shoulder barely touching mine, warm and steady and present. I breathed in cedar and cold air and the distant river. Then I looked up at both Alpha Kings and said, "When do we leave?" Dorian looked at Caspian. Caspian looked at Dorian. The eyebrow conversation happened in under 2 seconds. I saw that, I said. Tomorrow morning, Dorian said, smoothly and without acknowledging the eyebrow comment. 6 a.m. We have a private flight out of Bradley International. I stared at him. Tomorrow morning. Yes. It is currently almost 10 p.m. Yes. You want me to pack my entire life and be at an airport in 8 hours? Not your entire life, Caspian said. 30 days worth. You can ship anything else you need once you're settled. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. You two planned this, I said. You came here tonight already knowing I'd say yes. We hoped, Dorian said carefully. We had a contingency, Caspian said at the same time. I pointed at Caspian. That one's honest. I appreciate that one. I turned to Dorian. You had a whole plan. We had several plans, he admitted, with the composure of a man who found this entirely reasonable. Marcus patted my shoulder. I'll help you pack. Marcus, you live 20 minutes from me and you don't have a car. I'll call a rideshare. This is important, Eliot. A man packs for Colorado with Alpha Kings. His best friend is there for the folding of the good shirts. Caspian made a sound. Brief, low, almost completely suppressed. But it was a laugh. An actual one, small and real, escaping through a gap in that controlled electric exterior, and the sound of it did something immediate and inconvenient to the frequency at the base of my skull. I turned to look at him before I could stop myself. He was looking at Marcus with something soft in his expression, genuine and unguarded, the way a person looks when they've been surprised into warmth by something they didn't see coming. Then he felt my gaze and looked at me, and the softness didn't disappear exactly. It just shifted, redirected. I looked away. Fine, I said to the air in front of me, to the river, to the general Hartford night. Fine, someone's coming with me to pack. Both of us, Dorian said. I turned around slowly. Excuse me. We have a security protocol, he said, with the tone of a man who understood this was not going to land well and was bracing appropriately. Once a candidate has confirmed, they remain in proximity of at least one alpha king until arrival at the territory. It's a protection measure. A protection measure, I repeated. You're telling me that 2 alpha kings are going to stand in my studio apartment in Hartford, Connecticut, while I figure out which sweaters to bring to Colorado. We can wait in the hallway, Caspian offered. My hallway is the width of a generous thought, Caspian. The name left my mouth before I registered using it, and the slight shift in his posture told me he noticed. Not uncomfortable. The opposite of uncomfortable. Like something had clicked into place that had been slightly misaligned before. I picked up my food bag and turned toward the park exit. Come on then, I said. And if either of you comments on the state of my apartment, I am not responsible for what happens to your eyebrows. Marcus fell into step beside me with the barely contained delight of someone who understood he was living inside a story he would be telling for the rest of his life. The walk back through Hartford's nighttime streets took 12 minutes. I knew because I counted, occupying my brain with something measurable while the rest of it dealt with the reality of what I had just agreed to. The 4 of us moved through quiet residential blocks, past closed storefronts and lit corner bodegas and a laundromat still humming at this hour. And the city was ordinary and familiar in the way that things become after years of living inside them. Comfortable and small and entirely unaware that anything significant had just occurred within its limits. Dorian and Caspian walked behind Marcus and me at a respectful distance. I could still smell them. Dark water and iron, ozone and pine, threading through the cold night air with a persistence that my Omega senses tracked without asking my permission first. My hands were warm the entire walk. My apartment building was a 4-story red brick structure on Affleck Street that had been built in the 1940s and renovated in the 1990s, and hadn't been significantly updated since either event. The lobby had a buzzing fluorescent light that the building manager had been promising to fix since I moved in 2 years ago. The elevator was technically functional, but made sounds that suggested it was working through something emotionally. I always took the stairs. I took the stairs now. All 3 flights. Dorian and Caspian followed without comment, which I respected. My apartment was number 314. The door had a small scratch on the lower left corner from the time Marcus and I tried to move a second-hand bookshelf in and miscalculated the angle by several critical inches. Inside was a studio that was, by any objective measure, compact. A bed in the far corner, made neatly because I could not function in an unmade bed, non-negotiable. This was a hill. A small kitchen along one wall. A desk covered in papers and 3 coffee mugs I kept forgetting to move. 1 large window overlooking the street. Bookshelves along every available vertical surface, which was doing a lot of work spatially and emotionally. I turned on the lamp by the desk, which threw the room in warm amber, and turned around to find both Alpha Kings standing just inside my doorway, on filling the available entry space with the particular density of men whose physical presence was calibrated for larger rooms. Caspian's eyes moved around the apartment with quiet attention. Not judgment, just the automatic cataloging of someone who read environments the way other people read text. Dorian looked at the bookshelves. Then he looked at me. You alphabetize by author's last name, he said. And by publication date within each author's catalog, yes. I pulled my duffel bag from the closet. Before you say anything, it's a perfectly reasonable system and it brings me a great deal of comfort. I wasn't going to say anything, Dorian said. Your eyebrow was. Caspian walked further into the apartment, slow and unhurried, and stopped in front of the bookshelf nearest the window. He tilted his head slightly, reading spines. I watched him from the corner of my eye while I pulled clothes from my dresser, trying to calculate 30 days in Colorado in terms of temperature and occasion, and also the psychological weight of packing for something you didn't fully understand yet. You have 3 copies of the same book, Caspian said. Different editions, different translators' notes. Don't. I wasn't going to. Your voice was. Marcus appeared in the doorway behind them, having apparently taken the stairs at a pace that required a brief recovery moment, and surveyed the situation with the calm of a man who had helped me pack for less dramatic occasions and understood the process. "Do they have weather in Colorado?" Marcus said. "Like real weather, mountain weather." "They have significant weather," Dorian confirmed. "Pack the wool sweater," Marcus told me. "The dark green one." I was going to pack the dark green one. And the boots, not the good ones, the actual functional ones. "Marcus, I know how to pack." "You once packed for a 4-day trip with 3 books and 1 pair of socks." "The books were essential, and I bought socks there." Caspian turned away from the bookshelf, and for a moment the lamplight hit the silver scar on his upper lip and the angles of his face in a configuration that required me to look at my duffel bag with significant focus. He moved toward the kitchen, which was 3 steps from where he'd been standing because that was the nature of my apartment, and looked at the counter. 3 coffee mugs, an empty French press, a small ceramic bowl I kept by the stove that held miscellaneous items, a lighter, 2 rubber bands, a guitar pick that belonged to someone I'd stopped thinking about years ago. He picked up the guitar pick, looked at it. The warmth in my palms spiked once, sudden and sharp, and I felt it travel up to my wrists. That was psychometry, the ability to read the emotional history of objects through touch, which was my other secret, the one that lived deeper than the fire and operated more quietly. Most of the time, I kept my hands away from other people's objects for exactly this reason. The pick would tell me nothing about Caspian. It had nothing to do with him. But his hands on something that had history, that carried residual feeling, made my ability resonate in his direction like a signal finding a tower. I felt the briefest impression before I shut it down. Grief. Old and settled. Much the kind that has been lived with long enough to become architectural. I folded a sweater very deliberately and put it in the bag. "That's a guitar pick," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I can see that." He set it back in the bowl. "Do you play?" "No, it was a gift a long time ago. I keep it because it annoys me to throw away things that were given with genuine feeling even when the feeling is gone." I paused. "That's probably more honesty than you needed for a question about a guitar pick." "I'll take the honesty," he said. Same quiet certainty as before. Like honesty was a currency he knew the value of because he'd gone without it. I zipped a section of the duffel and moved to the bookshelf, pulling 2 titles that I was not going to Colorado without under any circumstances. Dorian tracked the movement, and when he saw the titles, his expression did the thing again. That brief almost shift that attempted something in the region of warmth before composure reasserted itself. "You read Omegaverse legal theory," he said, looking at the spine of one. "I read everything. That one specifically because if I'm going to understand the system I live inside, I'd rather understand its actual legal architecture than just accept the version of it I was handed." Dorian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I wrote a chapter in the 2nd edition of that book." I looked at the book in my hand. I looked at him. "Chapter 7, he said. Dual bond precedent in territorial succession law." I opened the book to the table of contents. Chapter 7, D. Vance. I stared at it for 3 full seconds. "You could have mentioned this earlier," I said. "You didn't ask." "I didn't know to ask, Dorian, because you didn't tell me you were apparently a legal theorist as well as an alpha king, which is a significant piece of personal information that would have been useful context during questions 1 through 6. "You have 14 more questions," he said. "There's time." The corner of Caspian's mouth. The footnote. Again. I put the book in the bag. Marcus handed me the dark green wool sweater without a word, and I took it without a word, and the domestic normalcy of the gesture in the middle of this entirely abnormal evening made something in my chest go soft in a way I couldn't immediately address. I packed steadily for 20 minutes while the room held its warmth and the lamp threw amber light, and Dorian sat carefully on the edge of the desk chair reading the back cover of a book he'd picked up and then put down 3 times, and Caspian stood by the window looking at the street below with the quality of presence that made silence feel inhabited rather than empty. When I zipped the duffel closed, the room settled. I stood at the foot of my bed and looked at my apartment. 2 years of careful, quiet living. Alphabetized books and cedar cologne and conversations practiced in my head for a man who never looked at me the way a person looks at something they actually want. I picked up the duffel. I picked up the envelope from the desk where I'd set it when I walked in, and I put it in the front pocket. "Okay," I said. "I'm ready." Dorian stood. Caspian turned from the window, and the lamplight caught his eyes, and he looked at me across the small, warm space of my studio apartment like I was the first thing in a long time that he wanted to keep looking at. The frequency in my skull was so steady now it had become something like a heartbeat. A second one. New and terrifying and completely inconveniently certain. "Let's go," Caspian said. And for the first time all evening, I didn't argue. The drive to the hotel where Dorian and Caspian were staying took 9 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the SUV's dashboard with the focused attention of someone who needed something measurable to hold on to, while the rest of their nervous system processed the fact that they were sitting in the back seat of a private vehicle between two alpha kings who smelled extraordinary and had opinions about legal theory, and kept looking at them like they were something worth looking at. Marcus had hugged me on the sidewalk outside my building with the full-body commitment of someone who understood the weight of the moment. "Call me when you land," he said into my shoulder. "I will." "Call me if anything feels wrong." "I will." "Call me if it feels right, too." "Actually, call me more for that one." I laughed and pulled back, and he held my face in both hands for 1 second. The way he'd been doing since we were 19 years old, and the world kept being larger and harder than expected. And then he let go. I got in the SUV. The hotel was a quiet, serious building in downtown Hartford, the kind that didn't advertise itself loudly because it didn't need to. Dorian and Caspian had the top floor. Of course they did. The elevator was silent and fast, and the hallway carpet was the deep blue of something expensive. And the room, when Dorian opened the door, was not a room. It was a suite. 2 connected suites, actually, with a shared central sitting area that was larger than my entire apartment, and furnished with the understated confidence of spaces that had never once had to justify their existence. I walked in, set my duffel by the door, and stood in the middle of the sitting area looking at it. "Nook, you can take the second bedroom," Dorian said, moving to the small kitchen along the far wall. "There's a connecting door, but it locks from your side." "Noted," I said. "Are you hungry? I'm fine." I turned around slowly, taking in the room. Floor-to-ceiling windows along the outer wall, Hartford's nighttime skyline spread below us, all lit glass and dark river and distant highway lines. A low couch in dark gray. A coffee table with a folder on it, closed, with the Ashford Peak territorial seal on the cover. I looked at the folder. The warmth in my hands stirred. I should not touch that folder. I knew that immediately and clearly. My psychometry had limits. It required sustained contact to read deeply. A brief brush was usually just surface noise. But official documents carried the concentrated emotional residue of every person who had handled them with intent. And right now, my ability was operating at an elevated sensitivity that I did not fully trust. I put my hands in my pockets. Caspian came out of the second room having shed his coat, in a dark sweater now, and stopped when he saw me standing in the middle of the room with my hands in my pockets staring at the folder with the expression of someone engaged in a private negotiation. "What's wrong?" he said. Not a question exactly. A read. "Nothing," I said. He looked at my face, looked at the folder, looked back at my face. "What's in the folder that's bothering you?" I considered deflecting. I was good at deflecting. I had a whole catalog of deflection techniques organized by situation type, and several of them would have worked beautifully right now. "Nothing's in it that's bothering me," I said instead, which was honest. "It's more that I have a thing with objects and official documents, and I'm choosing not to touch it until my nervous system is operating at a more reasonable frequency." Caspian was quiet for a moment. "A thing with objects," he said carefully. "Psychometry," I said. I can read emotional histories through touch. It's generally manageable. Tonight it's less manageable because I've had a significant amount of emotional stimulation and my ability tends to amplify when I'm running hot. I paused. Also, I'm literally running hot. My core temperature elevates when I'm emotionally activated. Pyrokinesis side effect. The two abilities interact in ways that are sometimes inconvenient. I said all of this to the folder rather than to Caspian because saying it to his face felt like too much directness for one evening. Silence. Then he said, "You have two abilities." Yes? Pyrokinesis and psychometry. Correct. And Crescent Vale didn't know about either. Crescent Vale thought I was a defective silent Omega with no notable designation markers. I finally looked up at him. Which tells you something about what happens when a pack decides who you are before they bother to find out. Something moved through his expression. Swift and complicated, guilt and anger braided together, and I realized the anger wasn't at me. Dorian had gone still in the kitchen doorway. "The Territorial Council is going to need to know," Dorian said. His voice was careful in a way that meant he was being precise on purpose. "I know," I said. Both abilities at that level of development, unregistered, in an Omega who was living under a standard pack designation agreement. "I know, Dorian." I kept my voice level. "I'm not unaware of the implications. I've been managing the implications since I was 15 years old and figured out that the system I lived inside would use what I was as a tool or a threat rather than just as a fact about a person." I paused. I was planning to disclose. After 30 days. After I decided whether Ashford Peak was somewhere I could actually trust. The room was very quiet. Caspian moved to the couch and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor for a moment in the way of someone assembling something carefully before they said it. "There's something in that folder," he said, "that you should probably see now, before tomorrow morning." The warmth in my palms pulsed. "What is it?" Dorian crossed the room and sat in the chair across from the couch. He looked at me steadily. "Sit down, Eliot." I sat. Not because I was told to, because the tone of it had shifted into something that required sitting. Dorian opened the folder. Inside were several documents, official-looking, territorial seal on each page, but on top was a single photograph, printed on plain paper, slightly grainy the way security footage prints are grainy. He turned it toward me. I looked at it. The photograph showed two men in conversation in what appeared to be a parking structure. The timestamp in the corner read 14 months ago. One of the men was Calder Ashford. Younger looking, or maybe just less carefully composed than the version I knew. The other man I didn't recognize immediately. Then I did. Declan Ashford, Calder's older brother, the previous Omega candidate who had left Ashford Peak. I'd never met him, but I'd seen pack photographs. They were talking. Close. Intense. Declan's hand was on Calder's arm, and his expression was the expression of someone delivering information they understood was significant. "This was taken 3 days after Declan left our territory," Dorian said, "before he returned to his family." I looked at the photograph and my psychometry pushed at my palms and I pressed them flat against my thighs and held it down. "He told Calder about the dual bond search," I said slowly. "Yeah, you told me that already." "He told Calder more than that," Caspian said. His voice had gone to that flat, careful place, the one he used when he was holding something back by force. "Declan didn't just tell Calder that we were looking. He told Calder what we were looking for specifically, the designation profile, the silent Omega presentation, the unregistered ability markers." I looked up from the photograph. "Calder knew about my abilities," I said. "He's known for at least 8 months, Dorian said. "Based on our timeline reconstruction, he received the detailed profile parameters from Declan around the same time we began our formal search. The cold that moved through me had nothing to do with the November air outside. He knew what I was," I said. "The whole time. He knew I had abilities and he never said anything. He never asked. He just..." I stopped, rewound, thought about 3 years of logistical questions and carefully maintained distance, and a man who looked at me the way you look at a document you're filing rather than something alive. He was keeping me, I said quietly. Not bonding with me. Keeping me, in case he needed leverage. We believe so, Dorian said. Leverage against you. Against the dual bond. Against the territorial consolidation. Calder's pack has political ties to 2 of the 6 council factions that want the Western and Eastern territories separated. Dorian's voice was even, but his eyes were not. If you were bonded to him, even incompletely, your designation profile would be legally compromised for any future bond claim. The dual bond would have been impossible. The room was very still. I sat inside the stillness and let the full shape of it arrive. 3 years. 3 years of practiced conversations in my head and cedar cologne for important moments, and telling myself stability was enough. 3 years of a man who had never once asked what I was thinking, who had never looked at me with actual curiosity, who had delivered a public rejection with the efficiency of someone completing a task they'd been working toward for a very long time. He hadn't rejected me because I wasn't enough. He had rejected me because I was too much, and he was finished using the fact of me as insurance. The warmth in my hands rose fast, and I stood up because sitting still was suddenly impossible. Eliot. Caspian's voice, careful. I'm fine, I said. Your hands. I said I'm fine. The words came out with an edge I hadn't intended, and I turned away from both of them, moving toward the window, pressing my palms flat against the cold glass. The cold against the heat was immediate and grounding. The contrast sharp enough to pull my focus back from the edge of something uncontrolled. Below me, Hartford spread out in its ordinary nighttime geometry. Streets and lights and the dark ribbon of the river and the bare trees of Riverside Park, where an hour ago I had been sitting on a bench asking questions and believing that at least some part of tonight had been mine. My reflection in the glass looked back at me. Jaw set, eyes too bright. My hands on the cold glass were faintly luminous. Amber under the skin, rhythmic, like something breathing. He used me as a placeholder, I said, onto my reflection, to the city below. For 3 years. He knew what I was. He knew what you were looking for. And he decided that the most useful thing I could be was an obstacle. I exhaled slowly. And then when the council pressure escalated and he needed to release me without it looking like a strategic move, he did it publicly so it looked like his choice. So it looked like I was the deficient one. Yes, Dorian said from behind me. He didn't soften it. He gave me the truth without wrapping it, which was, I was discovering, his particular form of respect. And Declan, I said. His brother. The one who left you. I looked at the glass. Was he part of this? Did he know what Calder was going to do with the information he gave him? Silence. A longer one. We don't know, Caspian said, and the tight line was back in his jaw, visible even in my reflection in the window. That's the part we haven't been able to determine. I stayed at the window for a long moment, palms against the glass, the cold working slowly against the heat. The city below moving through its ordinary night with complete indifference to the fact that I was standing above it reconstructing the architecture of 3 years of my life and finding a different structure underneath than the one I'd been told was there. Then I said, very quietly, I want to ask you something and I need you to answer without the diplomatic version. Ask, Dorian said. I turned around. Both of them were watching me, still and present and grave in a way that told me they understood the weight of this moment and were not trying to manage it, just hold it with me. Did you come to Hartford tonight because you genuinely believe I'm the person for this bond? I said. Or did you come because Calder was about to release me and you needed to get here first before someone else found me? The question sat in the room like something physical. Caspian stood up from the couch. He crossed to where I was standing at the window, stopped 2 feet away, and looked at me with the full, unguarded weight of those dark eyes with no footnote and no electricity and no controlled edges. Both things can be true, he said. I looked at him. We needed to get here before the window closed, he said. That's true. And the moment I heard you tell Calder his jacket was very pressed, standing in a room full of people who just watched him dismantle you, I wanted you to come to Colorado for reasons that had nothing to do with politics. He held my gaze. Both things are true. I won't pretend one cancels the other. But I won't pretend the second one isn't real either. The frequency in my skull was very loud. My palms were cooling against the glass. I looked past Caspian to Dorian, who was watching from across the room with that deep water steadiness. And he said nothing, but his eyes said the same thing Caspian had just said, in the language of a man who communicated more honestly in silence than most people did in paragraphs. I looked back at Caspian. Close. Too close for the state of my nervous system. The ozone and pine of him was immediate, and the scar on his lip was right there, and the warmth from my palms had stopped being cold glass warmth and started being something else entirely. Okay, I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. Okay, he said. Both things being true is something I can work with, I said. I've been surviving on less honesty than that for 3 years. This is already better. Something crossed his face, fast and complicated and real. He lifted his hand slowly, telegraphing the movement completely, and tucked a strand of my hair back from my forehead with 2 fingers. Light, brief. The kind of touch that asked nothing and said everything. I felt it in the frequency, the tuning fork ringing clean. Get some sleep, he said softly. Colorado tomorrow. I nodded. I picked up my duffel. I walked to the second bedroom door and I stopped with my hand on the frame and I said without turning around, for what it's worth, the jacket comment. I was terrified when I said it. Silence. Then Caspian said, I know. That's why it was perfect. I closed the door behind me. I stood in the dark of the room for a long moment, back against the door, duffel strap in my hand, the warmth in my palms finally settling into something low and steady and almost quiet. Almost, but not quite. Because somewhere in the weight of everything the evening had delivered, underneath Calder's manipulation and the folder's cold documentation and the 3 years I was going to have to rebuild my understanding of, something else was sitting. Something that felt, against every rational argument I could construct, a great deal like the beginning of something true. And I had no idea yet whether that was the most hopeful thing that had ever happened to me, or the most dangerous. I didn't sleep. Not immediately, anyway. I lay on top of the hotel bed covers with my jacket still on, and my boots still on, and my duffel on the floor beside me, staring at the ceiling of a room that cost more per night than my monthly electric bill. And I thought about 3 years. I thought about them the way you think about something you've been carrying in one hand for so long your body forgot it was weight. The slight lean, the compensated posture, the way your shoulder stops hurting because the hurt becomes ordinary, and ordinary becomes invisible, and invisible becomes the shape of your life. Calder had known what I was. I turned that over and over until the edges of it were smooth from handling. He had known about the pyrokinesis, about the psychometry. He had received a detailed designation profile from his brother 14 months ago that essentially described me as the exact Omega-2 alpha kings we're searching the entire country for, and he had looked at that information and made a calculation. Keep Eliot close. Not close enough to bond. Close enough to block. I was a door he'd been standing in front of. Not a person he'd been standing beside. The ceiling was a smooth, expensive cream color. I looked at it and breathed and made a deliberate decision to feel the full weight of that before I moved past it. Not to perform grief, not to perform anger, because I was alone and this was real and it deserved real engagement. 3 years of my life had been structured around a lie, and that was simply, factually, a significant thing to absorb. I absorbed it. It took about 40 minutes. Then I sat up. My palms were cool. My head was clear in the specific way that follows after you've stopped fighting something and simply let it arrive and move through. The frequency at the base of my skull was quiet, not absent, just settled. The way a sound becomes background when you stop listening for it as a threat. I pulled my knees up and sat in the dark of the hotel room and thought, now practically. I had agreed to 30 days in Colorado with 2 men I had met 4 hours ago, one of whom had written a chapter in a book I owned, and the other of whom had nearly laughed at something Marcus said, and both of whom had looked at me tonight with a quality of attention that I hadn't been given in 3 years and possibly longer. I had 2 unregistered abilities and a cleared rejection record pending and a duffel packed with the dark green sweater and both editions of a book on territorial succession law. I had a father in New Hampshire who I should probably call. I had Marcus, who was already going to make me tell him everything the moment I landed. I had a name in Hartford that now meant something different than it had this morning. Not less, not broken, just different, like a map that has been corrected rather than discarded. I got up. I moved to the window and stood looking out at the city, lower floor than the sitting room, different angle, but still Hartford, still the river, just visible between buildings, and still the familiar geometry of streets I'd walked for 2 years. I pressed one hand flat against the glass, cool and smooth. I pushed my ability gently against it, not trying to read, just using it the way you use a sense to orient yourself. The glass had no significant history. Manufacturing process, shipping, installation, the anonymous touch of maintenance workers. Clean. My ability settled. Behind me, through the connecting door, I could hear the suite. Not voices, just presence. The particular quality of occupied space, the faint sounds of 2 people existing on the other side of a wall. A door closing softly. Footsteps, brief. Then silence. I wondered if either of them was sleeping. I wondered if Caspian was at the window on his side doing something similarly irrational, like standing in his boots at midnight touching the glass. The thought made the corner of my mouth move against my will. I pushed off the window and made a decision. I unlocked the connecting door and opened it. The sitting room was dim, only the city light through the large windows. The lamp by the kitchen switched off. Dorian was at the desk in the corner with a laptop open, its light casting sharp shadows across his face, still in his shirt, though his coat was hung over the chair back. He looked up the moment I opened the door, which meant he'd been tracking the room's sounds the way someone does when they're not actually absorbed in their work. Caspian was on the couch, not sleeping, so sitting with one foot on the coffee table and a phone face down on his thigh, and his eyes already on the door like he'd been expecting it to open. Neither of them said anything. I walked to the couch and sat down on the opposite end from Caspian, pulled one knee up, and looked at the dark city through the big windows. I'm not good at sleeping when my head is busy, I said. I figured I should disclose that now so it's not surprising later. Later, Caspian said, and the word had a very particular weight, the quiet acknowledgement of a future tense that neither of us was taking for granted. In Colorado, I said, during the 30 days, not as a statement of anything. I know, he said. I looked at him sideways. He was watching me with the kind of attention that felt like a hand held slightly open, not grasping, just available. Can I ask you something? I said. Yes? Declan, I kept my voice even. You don't have to answer if it's too much, but I felt something when you mentioned him tonight. Both times. You both did, and you're both very controlled, so the fact that it showed means it's still close to the surface. Caspian was quiet for a moment. In the dim light, the scar on his lip was a thin silver line, and his eyes were very dark, and the ozone and pine of him was low and warm in the closed air of the suite. He was the first person in years who made the territory feel like a home rather than a responsibility, Caspian said finally. That's not a small thing when you've been raised to see the territory as a function. A pause. When he left, it wasn't just losing him. It was the confirmation of something I'd been afraid of for a long time. That the position makes you unlivable, I said. His eyes moved to me. Sharply. The way eyes move when a person says precisely the thing you haven't found words for yet. Yes, he said. I nodded slowly. Calder made me feel like that. Deficient. Like the problem was in my composition rather than in his capacity to see me. I looked at the window. It's a particular kind of loneliness, when you can't tell anymore if you're actually broken or if you've just been living with someone who needed you to be. Silence. From across the room, Dorian spoke. You're not broken. Quiet. Direct. The tone of a man stating a fact he had verified. I looked at him. He was watching me from the desk with his hands flat on either side of the laptop and his eyes doing that deep water thing that made me feel seen in a way that was still slightly too much to look at straight on. I know, I said. And the thing was, sitting in that dim room in the middle of the night with the city below and the river somewhere in the dark and the warmth in my hands steady and calm, I actually did know. I think I've always known. It's just easier to know it when someone else isn't working very hard to convince you otherwise. Dorian closed the laptop. He stood up from the desk and crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest the couch. Not the couch itself, just close enough that the space between us had changed its nature. And he looked at me with the careful attention of a man who had spent years keeping people at the distance of a managed relationship and was, right now, choosing something different. I want to tell you something, he said. Okay, I said. When we read your designation profile 8 months ago, it was a match on paper, a solution to a specific problem. That's where it started. He paused. The night we arrived in Hartford before the ceremony, I read your PAC record, the full one, not the designation summary, your educational record, your conduct notes, the informal observations from PAC elders over the years. Another pause. Someone in your PAC wrote approximately 6 years ago that you demonstrated, quote, unusually developed self-possession for a secondary designation. I blinked. I remember that. Elder Haynes. He said it like it was a criticism. It's not a criticism, Dorian said. It is the most accurate description of a person I have encountered in years of reading designation profiles. He held my gaze. I came to Hartford tonight to find a solution. I stayed because I wanted to meet the person. The quiet in the room was complete. I sat inside it and let it be what it was. Not comfortable exactly, not uncomfortable either, something more honest than both. The particular quiet of a moment that is real and knows it and doesn't need anything added to it. Caspian shifted on the couch. Not toward me, just a shift, settling, and his hand moved to rest on the cushion between us, open, palm up, not reaching. Just present. I looked at his hand, the knuckles, the long fingers, and the faint scar across the back of his right hand that matched the one on his lip, both old and settled, part of the geography of him. I could read it. If I touched it, I would feel whatever history that scar carried. I knew that as clearly as I knew anything about my ability tonight. I didn't touch it, but I moved my hand to the cushion beside his. Not touching. Close. The warmth from my palm radiated outward in the small space between us, and I felt the frequency shift, just slightly, into something lower and steadier and enormously, terrifyingly calm. Tell me something true, I said, to both of them, to the room. Something you haven't told anyone else. Not territorial business, not strategy, just something true. Silence. Then Caspian said, I learned to cook because the first Alpha King suite I lived in had a kitchen, and I didn't know what to do with a room that was just for something quiet. He looked at the window. I make breakfast every morning. It's the only hour of the day that belongs to just me. I looked at him. Something in my chest turned over softly. Dorian said, I have read the same 3 pages of the same novel every night for 2 years without advancing past them. I tell myself it's because I'm tired. It's because I'm waiting for something to change enough that the story can move forward. He looked at his hands. I don't know what I was waiting for. The city moved below us, indifferent and bright. I said, I talk to my mother's cedar cologne sometimes, not to communicate with her. Just to say things out loud that I'm not ready to say to anyone real yet. I paused. I told it tonight that I was scared, before the ceremony, that I already knew it wasn't going to work with Calder, and I was scared of what came after knowing. What comes after knowing, Caspian said quietly, is being free. I looked at him. He was looking at me with the full, completed version of that expression. No footnote, no edge, no controlled electric surface. Just him, underneath all of it, steady and scarred and real. Yeah, I said. My voice was very quiet. I'm starting to think so. The night held around us, warm and still. And for the first time since I walked out of that ceremony hall in my good iron shirt smelling like cedar and hope, I felt the specific relief of not having to perform okayness for anyone in the room. I was not okay yet, but I was going to be. And that, right now, in this dim suite above Hartford's ordinary sleeping city, was more than enough to carry into tomorrow. 6 a.m., I said finally. 6 a.m., Dorian confirmed. I stood up. Caspian's hand was still on the cushion where I'd left mine near it, and I looked at it once more before I moved. Then I did something that surprised me. I reached down and pressed my fingertips to the back of his hand. Light. Brief. 1 second of contact. The psychometry opened, and what I felt was not grief this time. What I felt was hope. Raw and recent and slightly terrified, the kind of hope that has been dormant for a long time and is only just remembering how to breathe. I lifted my fingers. Caspian hadn't moved. I walked back to the connecting door without looking back because looking back was not something I was capable of right now without losing the structural composure I was working very hard to maintain. Eliot, Caspian said. I stopped. For what it's worth, he said, and his voice was low and unhurried and completely unguarded. Whatever you felt just now, it's been there since the park. I stood with my hand on the doorframe. Get some sleep, Caspian, I said. You too, he said. I went through the door. I did not sleep for another hour. But when I did, I dreamed of mountains. Not the flat, distant suggestion of mountains you see from highways, that bluish smudge on the horizon that could be clouds or could be something permanent. Real mountains. Close and enormous and covered in the kind of snow that looks like it has always been there and intends to stay. I dreamed of standing at the base of something vast and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, appropriately small. Not diminished, just small the way a person is small when they're standing inside something larger than their problems. The good kind of small. The kind that is actually relief. I woke up at 5:43 a.m. to the Hartford gray light coming through the hotel curtains and the distant sound of the city finding its morning, and I lay there for exactly 2 minutes before I got up, washed my face, put on the dark green wool sweater, and picked up my duffel. I opened the connecting door. Dorian was already dressed, standing at the kitchen counter with 2 cups of coffee, and he held one out without a word when I appeared in the doorway. I took it with both hands, and the warmth of it moved through my palms in a way that had nothing to do with pyrokinesis, and everything to do with the simple human fact of someone preparing something for you before you asked. Thank you, I said. He nodded once. From the second bedroom came the sound of movement, a drawer closing, and then Caspian appeared in his doorway pulling a jacket on, hair slightly less composed than last night, and he stopped when he saw me. You slept, he said. Eventually, I said. The side of his mouth moved. The footnote. Good. We left Hartford at 6:04 a.m. The city was pale and quiet around us, streets mostly empty, the early light turning everything silver and provisional. Now I looked out the SUV window at the buildings passing and felt the particular texture of leaving somewhere that has held you without quite fitting you. The specific combination of grief and relief that has no single word in English but probably should. Marcus had texted at 5:58 a.m. The text said, "You better call me the second you land, or I will contact both Alpha Kings directly, and I have their names now, so don't test me." I smiled at my phone and texted back, "I love you, I'll call." His response was immediate. "Obviously. Now go. Mountains are waiting." Bradley International in the early morning was quiet in the way that airports are quiet before the day decides to begin. A held breath quality, the hum of systems running underneath the stillness. The private terminal was smaller and calmer than the main concourse. A narrow carpeted space with wide windows looking out at the tarmac where a mid-sized jet sat with its running lights on. I looked at it. "That's ours," Caspian said beside me. "I've never been on a private plane," I said. "It's like a regular plane," he said, "but quieter and no one takes your armrest." I laughed, genuine, unguarded, the kind that happens before you decide to allow it. Caspian looked at me when I laughed, and his expression did the full open thing again, the one underneath all the controlled edges, and I looked away before either of us had to do anything about it. The flight to Colorado was 2 hours and 40 minutes. I spent the first hour reading. Dorian spent it working, quiet and focused at the small table across the aisle. Caspian spent it making me eat something from the small galley kitchen because apparently he had opinions about people not eating breakfast, which was both slightly bossy and entirely welcome given that I had consumed nothing since a late-night burger and I was running on 4 hours of sleep and the structural determination of someone who had decided to keep moving forward. He made eggs. In a small airplane galley kitchen, with the focused quiet of someone for whom cooking was the 1 hour of the day that belonged only to him. He made scrambled eggs and toast and set the plate in front of me without ceremony. I looked at the plate. I looked at him. "You said breakfast was yours," I said. "I said that hour belongs to me," he said, sitting across from me. I didn't say I couldn't share it. I ate the eggs. They were, genuinely, not very good. Somewhere over Kansas, with the flat middle of the country spread below us in its winter-brown geometry, Dorian closed his laptop and looked out the window and said, without turning, "The council convenes in 9 days. They'll want to meet you." "I know," I said. "They will try to assess you. Some of them will be measuring whether you're manageable." "They're going to have a difficult time," I said pleasantly. Dorian turned from the window and looked at me, and the almost laugh happened again, more fully this time. A brief, controlled exhale through the nose that on his face constituted something close to open amusement. "Yes," he said. "I expect they will." Caspian was watching me from across the small aisle with the expression of someone who was looking forward to this very much. "Stop looking entertained," I told him. "I'm not," he said, with the tone of a man who absolutely was. Colorado arrived below us as a gradual revelation. The flat eastern plains giving way to the first suggestion of elevation, gentle rises that built and built until suddenly the Rockies were there, impossible and white and enormous, exactly as they'd been in the dream. I pressed my face slightly toward the window and felt something in my chest open like a door that had been closed for a long time. Ashford Peak territory was in the western foothills, a private airstrip and then a 40-minute drive through mountain roads that wound between pine forests and rock faces and overlooks where you could see valleys below filled with snow and silence. I sat in the back of a new SUV with my duffel between my feet and watched Colorado happen outside the window with the feeling of someone arriving somewhere they have not been before, but that registers inexplicably as familiar. The main house, if it could be called that, was built into the hillside like it had grown there. Stone and dark timber and wide glass that caught the mountain light and threw it back softer. It was large without being aggressive about it. The architecture of a place that understood it didn't need to compete with its surroundings. I got out of the car and stood in the cold mountain air and breathed. Pine and snow and altitude and the distant sound of wind moving through the high trees and underneath it, faint and warm and completely unmistakable. The combined scent of dark water and iron and ozone and pine that had been threading through my nervous system since a Hartford parking area the night before. Home. The word arrived without permission, and I stood very still when it did, examining it, turning it over the way I'd turned everything over in the last 24 hours, checking its weight, checking whether it held. It held. "You okay?" Caspian said beside me. "Yes," I said. And this time it wasn't the load-bearing kind of fine. It was just true. He stood beside me looking at the mountain view, and for a moment we were just two people standing in the cold outside a house that was going to ask things of both of them. And the moment was quiet and real, and neither of us needed to fill it. Dorian came around from the other side of the car and stood on my other side. And the three of us stood there in the mountain morning with the pine forest below, and the sky above, and the cold air between us, and everything still unfinished and unmade and perfectly, terrifyingly open. 30 days, I said. 30 days, Dorian confirmed. And then we talk, all of us, honestly. Honestly, Caspian said. I picked up my duffel. I turned to face the house, the mountain, the wide-open fact of what came next. Okay, I said. Show me where the kitchen is. I want to learn how to make breakfast. Caspian went very still beside me. Then he turned and looked at me with the full, open weight of everything underneath his surface. No edges, no control. Just him. Yeah? He said. Quiet, like the word meant more than it was carrying. Yeah, I said, like I understood that it did. He smiled, not the footnote, not the suggestion, the real one, full and slow and completely unguarded, and it rearranged something fundamental in the air between us in a way that I suspected was going to be permanent. Dorian opened the front door and held it, and the warm light from inside spilled out onto the cold stone steps, and I walked through it. I walked through it with my shoulders straight and my hands warm, and the frequency in my skull singing clean and steady, no longer a warning, no longer a question, an answer. Behind me, the door closed softly and the mountain air stayed outside where it belonged, and the house settled around us like something that had been waiting. And I stood in the entrance of Ashford Peak and understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has finally stopped lying to themselves, that I had not come here to be chosen. No, I'd come here because I'd finally chosen myself. Everything else, the bond, the council, the 30 days and everything beyond them, would follow from that. And for the first time in 3 years, wearing my second-best sweater in someone else's kitchen doorway at the edge of the Rocky Mountains, I was not afraid of what followed. I was ready for it. I was, at last, entirely and completely ready. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Hit subscribe. The next story drops soon.